The world of horror cinema is filled with unforgettable villains. We often assume these monsters are born solely from a writer's imagination. Yet the truth behind some iconic screen terrors is far more unsettling. These cinematic nightmares have a common, chilling ancestor, a real person whose life was a true story of horror. Consider three titans of terror, and these films, each a masterpiece of suspense and dread, seem distinct in their horrors, yet a single dark shadow looms large behind them all. This shared wellspring of inspiration is not a mythical creature but the story of one man. His name, perhaps unfamiliar to some, is intrinsically linked to these cinematic fiends. Prepare to explore the depths of a disturbed mind and the unsettling legacy it left behind. The singular shadow that connects these cinematic nightmares bears a name: Ed Gein. He was, by most outward appearances, an unremarkable man. A quiet farmer, a resident of the small, unassuming town of Plainfield, Wisconsin. Neighbors might have described him as odd, perhaps a bit reclusive. Beneath this quiet facade lay a reality so grotesque it seemed torn from the pages of the most lurid pulp novel. Ed Gein's existence was a carefully constructed illusion, masking a world of macabre obsession and unspeakable acts. His twisted crimes, when finally brought to light, would horrify an entire nation. He was not just a criminal, he became a symbol of hidden evil. His crimes were not born of typical motives like greed or revenge. Instead, they stemmed from a deeply warped internal world. This exploration is dedicated to dissecting the life, crimes, and cultural legacy of Ed Gein. Our journey will take us from his formative years into the desolate solitude of his infamous farmhouse. We will trace the steps that led him down a path of grave robbery and murder. The story of Ed Gein is undeniably disturbing. The details of his activities are graphic and unsettling, yet alongside the horror there is a grim fascination. How could such a man exist? What forces shaped his psyche? His case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the human condition. This is more than just a recounting of grim events. It is a deep dive into a dark chapter of American history. His legacy is a testament to the enduring power of real-life horror. Edward Theodore Gein first entered the world on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse County, Wisconsin. The Gein family unit was troubled from its inception. His father, George Philip Gein, was often lost to the haze of alcohol. The dominant force in this fractured family was Augusta Wilhelmina Leark Gein, Ed's mother. Augusta was a woman of formidable will and deeply entrenched fire and brimstone Lutheran beliefs. She viewed the world outside her narrow perspective as a cauldron of sin and moral decay. Her marriage to George was reportedly one of convenience, rather than affection. She openly despised her husband, viewing his alcoholism and perceived weakness with unbridled contempt. Even before the family's infamous move to the isolated farmstead, the atmosphere within the Gein household was thick with unspoken tensions. These formative years laid the foundational stones for Ed's later psychological development. Augusta Gein's religious fervor was a roaring inferno of condemnation. She believed fervently in an omnipresent God who was quick to anger and swift to punish. The concepts of hellfire, eternal damnation, and the pervasive sinfulness of humanity were terrifying realities for Augusta. Her disdain for the outside world was absolute. Alcohol was a demon, but her condemnation extended far beyond drink. She preached that all forms of pleasure and worldly enjoyment were snares set by the devil. Augusta harbored a deep-seated hatred and suspicion of all women, with the singular exception of herself. This toxic ideology was a constant refrain in the Gein household. Augusta communicated these harsh beliefs to Ed and Henry through daily, often graphic readings from the Old Testament. This constant immersion in themes of death, punishment, and sin began to warp Ed's understanding of morality and human relationships. In 1914, when Ed was approximately 8 years old, Augusta Gein made a decisive move to further insulate her family. She sold the family's grocery store and home in La Crosse and purchased a desolate farm on the outskirts of Plainfield, Wisconsin. This was a strategic retreat, a deliberate act of self-imposed exile. The remoteness of the location was its primary appeal. The Plainfield farm was a place of stark solitude. It was situated far from the nearest neighbors, effectively cutting the Gein family off from the casual interactions of even a small rural town. Augusta's motivation was clear: to create a fortress against temptation. This move intensified the already significant isolation the boys experienced. Life on the farm was Spartan and relentlessly laborious. The lack of normal social development and the constant immersion in Augusta's bleak worldview created a fertile ground for the development of a deeply skewed perception of reality. Augusta Gein's control over her sons, particularly Ed, was absolute and meticulously maintained through a combination of psychological manipulation, religious indoctrination, and overt disapproval. She was the undisputed matriarch, her word carrying the weight of divine authority within the isolated confines of their Plainfield farm. Any nascent sign of independence or deviation from her strict code of conduct was met with swift and severe censure. She cultivated an atmosphere where her approval was the ultimate prize and her displeasure the most feared consequence. This created a dynamic where obedience was not just expected but deeply ingrained as a survival mechanism for her younger, more sensitive son. One of Augusta's primary methods of control involved actively sabotaging any attempts by Ed or Henry to form relationships outside the family. If the boys showed any inclination towards making friends at school or in the rare instances they encountered other children, Augusta would intervene. She would either forbid the interaction outright, often accompanying her prohibition with dire warnings about the sinfulness and bad influence of others, or she would punish them for their attempts. This systematic isolation ensured that her sons remained emotionally and socially dependent on her, with little opportunity to develop alternative perspectives or experience healthy peer relationships, which are crucial for normal psychological development. The daily Bible readings were another cornerstone of Augusta's architecture of control. She did not choose passages that spoke of comfort, love, or redemption. Instead, she focused intently on the most graphic and terrifying sections of the Old Testament, reciting vivid accounts of death, divine punishment, plagues, and gruesome retribution for sin. These readings were not intended to inspire faith but to instill fear of God, fear of sin, and by extension fear of disobeying Augusta, who positioned herself as God's righteous enforcer. This constant barrage of religious terror, fused with Ed's naturally shy and repressed nature, created a deeply troubled internal landscape where sin and sexuality became inextricably linked with horror and maternal disapproval. While both boys were subjected to Augusta's oppressive regime, Ed seemed to absorb her teachings more profoundly and uncritically than his older brother Henry. Henry, as he grew older, began to exhibit signs of questioning their mother's extreme views, and even occasionally dared to speak back to her, much to Augusta's fury. Ed, in stark contrast, remained largely passive and obedient, seemingly eager to please his mother and avoid her wrath. Augusta, in turn, appeared to favor Ed, perhaps seeing in him a more successful product of her efforts, a soul she could more completely mold. This intense, almost symbiotic relationship between Ed and his mother became the central, defining feature of his young life, shaping his psyche in ways that would have devastating future consequences. Section 5. The fraying threads, loss, fire, and utter solitude. The first significant crack in the insular world of the Gein family appeared with the decline and eventual death of George Gein, the father. George passed away on April 1, 1940, due to heart failure, a consequence of his years of alcoholism. His death, while perhaps not deeply mourned by Augusta, who had long treated him with contempt, nonetheless altered the family dynamic. It removed one of the few, albeit largely passive, male figures from the household, leaving Ed and Henry solely under Augusta's ever-watchful eye. For Ed, who was then in his mid-30s, his father's passing likely reinforced his mother's narratives about the wages of sin and the weakness inherent in men who succumb to worldly vices. As the years passed on the isolated Plainfield farm, Henry Gein began to show increasing signs of independence and a growing concern for his younger brother Ed. Unlike Ed, who remained deeply enmeshed with Augusta, Henry started to voice his unease about their mother's suffocating influence and her strange, intense relationship with Ed. He worried about Ed's social awkwardness and his blind devotion to Augusta's distorted worldview. There were reports that Henry even dared to speak critically of Augusta to Ed, suggesting that her beliefs were not entirely sound and that Ed needed to develop a life of his own. This budding defiance from her elder son was undoubtedly a source of great displeasure for Augusta. Then, in May 1944, tragedy struck the Gein family again, this time under far more mysterious and unsettling circumstances. A marsh fire broke out on the Gein property, and Ed and Henry were supposedly fighting the blaze. When the fire was extinguished, Henry was missing. Ed later reported to the authorities that he had lost sight of his brother in the smoke and dense undergrowth. Henry's lifeless body was discovered later that day, lying face down. While the official cause of death was listed as asphyxiation, bruises were reportedly found on his head, and curiously, the area where his body lay appeared to be untouched by the fire. Despite these oddities and Ed's somewhat contradictory accounts, no formal investigation was pursued at the time. With Henry gone, Ed was left as Augusta's sole companion and caregiver. However, Augusta herself was not destined to live much longer. Her health began to deteriorate rapidly following a paralytic stroke. Ed devoted himself entirely to her care, tending to her every need with a singular, almost obsessive focus. Despite his efforts, Augusta Gein suffered a second stroke and passed away on December 29, 1945. Her death at the age of 67 severed the final thread connecting Ed to any semblance of a normal family structure. At 39 years old, Edward Gein was now truly, utterly alone in the isolated farmhouse, left to confront the deafening silence and the overwhelming weight of his mother's enduring, terrifying legacy. Section 1. The Weight of Solitude, Augusta's Lingering Shadow. With Augusta Gein's death in December 1945, the final anchor tethering Ed to any semblance of conventional reality snapped. The farmhouse, once filled with her commanding voice and iron-willed presence, fell into an oppressive, echoing silence. Ed was 39 years old. He had never known life without his mother's constant, overwhelming influence. He had never lived independently, never forged a meaningful adult relationship, never truly navigated the world on his own terms. Now, he was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The isolation Augusta had so meticulously cultivated around her family now enveloped Ed entirely. A suffocating blanket from which there seemed no escape, and perhaps no desire to escape. The psychological impact of this profound loss was immediate and devastating. Augusta had been the sun around which Ed's entire existence revolved. Her pronouncements were law, her approval his life's aim. Grief, raw and disorienting, consumed him, but this was no ordinary bereavement. It was a grief compounded by a terrifying, unwelcome freedom. The rules that had governed his every thought and action were suddenly absent, yet their echoes resonated louder than ever in the empty rooms. Her voice, her judgments, her condemnations of the world and its sinfulness continued to dictate his internal landscape. This void, this sudden absence of his primary controller and companion, accelerated his already precarious mental state into a rapid, downward spiral. In a desperate, poignant act of preservation, Ed attempted to freeze time, to keep Augusta's presence intact. He sealed off the rooms she had most frequented, her upstairs bedroom, the downstairs parlor, and the main living room. These spaces became shrines, untouched by time or the encroaching chaos of his own life. He boarded up the doorways, leaving them as silent monuments to her memory. For himself, he retreated to a small, squalid bedroom next to the kitchen, and the kitchen itself became his primary living area. This physical division of the house mirrored the growing schism in his mind, one part preserved for Augusta, the other descending into darkness and neglect. The farm, once a place of relentless toil under Augusta's direction, began to fall into disrepair. Ed's personal hygiene deteriorated. He seemed to have little interest in the practicalities of survival beyond the bare minimum. The outside world, which Augusta had taught him to despise and fear, receded even further. He was withdrawing, sinking deeper into an internal reality that was increasingly distorted, populated by the ghosts of his past and the burgeoning seeds of his macabre obsessions. The Plainfield farmhouse, his only home, was slowly transforming. It was becoming less a dwelling and more a mausoleum, a testament to his mother's enduring power and his own crushing, unbearable despair. Section 2, The Call of the Cemetery, Seeking a Lost Connection. The profound loneliness that engulfed Ed Gein after Augusta's passing began to fester, mutating from simple grief into something far more aberrant and disturbing. The silence of the farmhouse became unbearable, a constant reminder of his utter isolation. He needed her. He needed to feel her presence, or at least the presence of women like her, women who embodied the complex mix of authority and unattainable femininity that Augusta represented. His thoughts, increasingly disordered, started to drift towards the local cemeteries. These quiet, somber places, repositories of the dead, began to exert a strange and powerful pull on his fractured psyche, offering a perverse kind of solace. His excursions to these graveyards commenced under the cloak of darkness. These were not casual wanderings but unholy pilgrimages, undertaken with a stealth and secrecy that belied the turmoil within. He was driven by a desperate, twisted compulsion to fill the gaping void Augusta had left. His initial forays were perhaps exploratory, a way to be physically near the dead, to bridge the chasm between his desolate existence and the memory of his mother. He wasn't looking to inflict harm, not yet. He was searching, in his profoundly disturbed way, for a connection, for a way to reclaim what he had lost, to find companionship among those who could no longer judge, reject, or condemn him. It was not long before these nocturnal visits escalated. The mere proximity to the dead was insufficient. His obsession demanded more. Ed began to unearth the recently buried, focusing his attention on middle-aged women, those whose age and descriptions might, in his warped perception, bear some resemblance to Augusta. The act of digging, of violating the sanctity of the grave, must have been accompanied by a potent cocktail of thrill and terror. Yet the compulsion driving him, a deeply rooted psychological imperative, overwhelmed any lingering societal taboos or fear of discovery. He was crossing a threshold from which there would be no return, stepping into a realm of profound moral and mental decay. The psychological state underpinning these horrific acts was far removed from simple curiosity or malicious mischief. Ed was operating under a profound delusion, a belief that he could somehow transcend the barrier between life and death. Perhaps he thought he could commune with these silent figures, or even in some way, bring a piece of them, and by extension Augusta, back into his solitary world. The women his mother had taught him to fear and revile in life became objects of intense fascination in death. In the graveyards of Plainfield, Ed Gein began his descent into a madness that would soon find tangible, terrifying expression within the walls of his isolated farmhouse. Section 3, Trophies of the Damned, a grisly collection begins. Ed Gein's nocturnal expeditions to the local cemeteries were not exercises in vandalism for its own sake. He was a collector, driven by a purpose so grotesque it defied rational understanding. He did not seek jewelry or other valuables interred with the deceased. His interest lay solely with the mortal remains themselves. He exhumed bodies, primarily those of women who reminded him of his mother, and took from them specific, horrifying trophies. Skulls were prized, as were significant sections of skin and various bones. The careful, almost methodical selection of these remains hinted at a grim plan already taking shape in the recesses of his deeply disturbed mind, a plan centered around his obsession with the female form as dictated by Augusta. The initial purpose behind this macabre collection was likely multifaceted, evolving as his psychosis deepened. At first, these human fragments may have served as tangible mementos, physical objects to anchor his memories of Augusta, or to populate his desolate world with some form of companionship, however ghastly. His lifelong fascination with anatomy, possibly sparked by the graphic tales of death and divine retribution Augusta read from the Bible, and perhaps further fueled by pulp magazines or medical texts he may have encountered, found a new, horrifying outlet. These trophies were not merely stored away, they became focal points for his increasingly bizarre fantasies and experiments. Soon, Ed began to experiment with the human remains he brought back to the farm. He attempted to preserve the skin, using crude methods learned from his limited readings. He cleaned and treated the bones, showing a morbid curiosity about their structure and potential uses. The farmhouse, particularly his small living quarters, transformed into a grotesque laboratory. Here, surrounded by the silent, decaying remnants of the dead, Ed Gein worked on his unholy projects, driven by impulses he likely did not fully comprehend himself, but was powerless to resist. The line between the living and the dead, already blurred in his mind, was now being physically dismantled within his home. As his collection of human remains grew, so too did the complexity of his delusions. The macabre items were not hoarded indiscriminately like a common pack rat's cache. Each piece, each fragment of bone or skin was intrinsically linked to his central, overwhelming obsession with Augusta and his desperate, twisted attempts to understand, possess, or even recreate the female form. He sought to deconstruct and then reconstruct femininity according to his own nightmarish vision, a vision profoundly warped by years of maternal domination and extreme psychological isolation. The trophies were more than just objects, they were the building blocks of his unraveling sanity. Section 4. The Farmhouse Transformed, a Landscape of Lunacy. The Gein farmhouse became a horrifying reflection of its sole occupant's fractured psyche. A stark, almost unbelievable contrast existed within its walls. Augusta's rooms, her bedroom, the parlor, the downstairs living room remained pristine, untouched, sealed off as sacred shrines to her memory. They were time capsules of her rigid order, silent testaments to her enduring influence. Yet just beyond these sealed doors, in the kitchen and the small adjoining room where Ed lived, a scene of unimaginable squalor and depravity unfolded. Here, filth accumulated, refuse piled up, and the air grew thick with the stench of decay and his gruesome ongoing projects. It was within his own living space that Ed Gein began to integrate his ghastly trophies into the fabric of his daily life. He was not content merely to collect, he began to create. Human skulls were fashioned into bowls, sometimes with the tops neatly sawn off. Chairs were reupholstered with tanned human skin. He crafted a lampshade from a human face, its features stretched taut. Leggings were made from human leg skin, and a corset from a female torso, skinned from shoulder to waist. These were not items hidden away in shame or fear. They were functional objects incorporated into his domestic environment, a chilling normalization of the horrific within his isolated, self-contained world. The psychological significance of this transformation of his home cannot be overstated. The farmhouse became a tangible extension of Ed's own disintegrating mind, a physical landscape of his lunacy. Each grotesque artifact he created was a monument to his deepening obsession, his complete detachment from societal norms, and his utter disregard for the sanctity of the human body. He was constructing a new reality for himself, one where the boundaries between the living and the dead, the human and the object, were not just blurred, but entirely obliterated. His home was his kingdom of the macabre, a place where his darkest fantasies took solid, terrifying form. The sheer audacity of these creations, conceived and executed in total isolation, speaks volumes about the depths of his psychosis. The farmhouse itself seemed to absorb the horror, becoming a silent, decaying accomplice to his madness. One can only imagine the atmosphere within those walls, the pervasive odors, the unsettling presence of human remains fashioned into everyday items. For any outsider, it would have been a scene of unimaginable terror. For Ed Gein, however, this meticulously crafted environment may have represented a strange kind of order, a comfort even, a world built entirely to his own grotesque specifications, a sanctuary from a world he could neither understand nor join. Section 5. The Mask of Mundanity, Plainfield's Odd Neighbor. Despite the unimaginable horrors unfolding within the confines of his remote farmhouse, Ed Gein presented a surprisingly unremarkable if somewhat eccentric face to the small community of Plainfield. He was generally known as a quiet and solitary man, a bit of a recluse, but few, if any, perceived him as a genuine threat. He took on odd jobs around the town, performing handyman tasks for various neighbors, and was even occasionally entrusted with babysitting local children. This ability to maintain a veneer of harmless oddity while engaging in such profound depravity is one of the most chilling aspects of his case, a testament to the deceptive nature of appearances. His interactions with the townsfolk were typically brief and unremarkable. He was often described as shy, quiet, and prone to mumbling, sometimes breaking into a strange, seemingly unprompted giggle. Some noted his tendency to launch into rambling, disjointed monologues on subjects that interested him, such as local history or hunting, but these were usually dismissed as the quirks of a man who was a bit slow or not quite right in the head. No one connected these eccentricities with anything more sinister. He was simply Odd Eddie, a fixture in the local landscape, peculiar but ultimately considered innocuous by those who encountered him in their daily lives. The effectiveness of this mundane facade was crucial to the continuation of his secret life. The physical isolation of his farm certainly played a role, shielding his activities from prying eyes. However, his ability to compartmentalize his existence to present a relatively benign front during his infrequent forays into town was equally important. He was in essence hiding in plain sight. The local perception of him as a harmless, if peculiar bachelor living alone contributed to a collective blind spot. The community simply could not conceive of the true extent of the darkness that resided just a few miles away, hidden behind the dilapidated walls of the Gein farm. This stark contrast between Ed Gein's public persona and his private, monstrous reality is central to the enduring horror of his story. He was not an obvious monster, not a figure who radiated menace. He was the quiet neighbor, the odd handyman, the man you might pass on the street without a second thought. This unsettling duality shattered the community's sense of security when his crimes were finally discovered. It forced a terrifying realization that unimaginable evil could lurk behind the most ordinary of masks, that the person next door could be capable of horrors beyond comprehension. The grave robbing, the collection of human remains, and the crafting of grotesque artifacts were all stepping stones towards a far more profound and disturbing ambition for Ed Gein. His ultimate obsession, the horrifying focal point of his psychosis, was the desire to create a woman suit. This was not merely about possessing parts of women or surrounding himself with their forms. It was about a terrifying, pathological attempt at transformation. He yearned to embody the female, and more specifically, to resurrect or become his deceased mother, Augusta. This was a deeply twisted quest for a macabre form of transubstantiation, a way to bridge the final gap left by her death. The psychological underpinnings of this ultimate delusion were rooted in his complex, suffocating relationship with Augusta. His entire identity had been shaped by her, his understanding of femininity dictated by her harsh judgments and overwhelming presence. With her gone, he was adrift. The creation of a woman's suit, meticulously assembled from the skin of deceased women, represented an extreme and pathological form of identification. If he could not have his mother back in life, perhaps he could, in the most literal and gruesome way imaginable, inhabit her form, wear her skin, and in doing so, recapture her essence or her perceived power over him and the world. This horrifying ambition marked a critical escalation in Ed Gein's madness. While his initial activities focused on scavenging from the already dead, the desire for better, fresher materials for his creations began to blur the lines. The morbid fascination with corpses was evolving into something far more dangerous. The woman's suit required specific components, and the limitations of grave robbing may have started to chafe against the urgency of his delusion. This shift, though perhaps not fully conscious at first, set him on a path that would inevitably lead from the profanation of the dead to violence against the living, the final step in his descent. By this stage, Ed Gein was living almost entirely within the confines of his elaborate and terrifying fantasy world. Reality had become a distant, irrelevant concept. In his distorted perception, wearing human skin, fashioning a suit to become his mother, was a logical, even necessary step towards fulfilling his deepest, most overwhelming psychological needs. The woman's suit stands as the ultimate chilling symbol of his profound grief, his unyielding obsession with Augusta, and the complete and utter psychotic break that had consumed him. The chilling chain of events that would finally rip the veil from Ed Gein's secret world began on a cold, ordinary Saturday. November 16, 1957, marked a day of profound loss for the small, tight-knit community of Plainfield, Wisconsin. Bernice Worden, the 58-year-old owner of the local hardware store, a familiar and trusted figure to nearly everyone in town, inexplicably disappeared. Her store, usually a hub of quiet commerce and neighborly chat, stood eerily silent. The cash register was found open, and a dark stain on the wooden floor hinted ominously at a violent struggle, a stark contrast to the mundane items still lining the shelves. Bernice was a widow, known for her straightforward demeanor and confidence. Her absence was immediately noticed and deeply felt. Her son, Frank Worden, served as a deputy sheriff in Plainfield. The personal and professional horror of his mother's disappearance spurred him into swift action. He knew his mother's routines, He knew she would not simply abandon her store, her responsibilities, her life. The scene at the hardware store screamed foul play. The missing rifle from the store's display rack and the last sales slip for a gallon of antifreeze became crucial. Early pieces of a terrifying puzzle that Frank was determined to solve. The investigation began with a grim urgency. Frank Warden, alongside Sheriff Art Schley, meticulously pieced together Bernice's last known movements. They interviewed locals, searching for any witness, any clue that might shed light on her sudden vanishing. The sales ledger in the hardware store provided the first tangible lead. It recorded the day's transactions, a mundane list that now held a potentially sinister significance. The final entry for that fateful Saturday was for a half-gallon of antifreeze. The customer? A name familiar to most in Plainfield, though perhaps not one immediately associated with violence: Ed Gein. This detail, the final transaction, immediately focused suspicion on the reclusive farmer. Gein was known to be peculiar, a man who largely kept to himself, but he was also a customer. Had Bernice Warden's last interaction been with him? Frank Warden recalled that Gein had been in the store the previous evening, inquiring about antifreeze and saying he would return the next morning to purchase it. The connection, though circumstantial, was strong enough to warrant a visit to Gein's isolated farm. As dusk began to settle on that anxious Saturday, the investigators prepared themselves for what they hoped would be answers, but what would ultimately be the discovery of unimaginable horrors. The name Ed Gein on the sales slip was more than just a customer record. It was a beacon in the terrifying fog of Bernice Warden's disappearance. Sheriff Art Schley and Deputy Frank Warden, driven by a mixture of dread and grim determination, knew their next step. Gein lived on a remote farmstead, miles outside of Plainfield, a place already shrouded in an aura of neglect and isolation. It was a location that few townsfolk ever visited, a property that mirrored the reclusive nature of its owner. The decision was made, they had to pay Ed Gein a visit. The antifreeze sale was the thread, and they had to see where it led. As the lawman approached the Gein farmstead later that evening, the atmosphere itself seemed to portend something dreadful. The property was run down, the fields untended, the buildings dilapidated and dark under the fading light. An air of profound decay hung over the place, a palpable sense of abandonment that went beyond mere poverty. The house itself appeared almost swallowed by the overgrown landscape, its windows like vacant eyes staring out into the encroaching night. There were no lights on, no signs of life, just an unnerving stillness that prickled the skin of the seasoned officers. This was not the home of an ordinary farmer, it felt like a place where secrets festered. Sheriff Schley, accompanied by another officer, Captain Lloyd Schoporster, first located Ed Gein not at the farm, but at a neighbor's house where he was having dinner. Gein seemed calm, almost unconcerned, when questioned about Bernice Warden. He admitted to being at the hardware store that morning, but denied any knowledge of her whereabouts. His placid demeanor did little to alleviate the officer's suspicions. With Gein temporarily detained, the investigators, now armed with a search warrant fueled by the mounting unease and the strange circumstances, proceeded towards the silent, dark farmhouse to look for Bernice Warden or any clue related to her vanishing. The officers, including a state crime lab investigator, arrived at the Gein property around 5 p.m. The doors were locked. Forcing their way into the summer kitchen, a woodshed-like attachment to the main house, they were immediately struck by the cold and the disarray. The air was stale, heavy with an unidentifiable, unpleasant odor that hinted at something deeply wrong. Flashlights cut through the gloom, their beams dancing over piles of junk, tools, and debris. It was in this initial cursory sweep of the outbuilding that the first truly shocking discovery was made, a discovery that would signal the beginning of a descent into a real-life house of horrors. Section 3. The Threshold of Terror. First Glimpse into Madness. The beam of Sheriff Art Schley's flashlight sliced through the oppressive darkness of the summer kitchen, a lean-to shed attached to the main Gein farmhouse. The air was frigid, the silence profound, broken only by the crunch of debris underfoot and the officer's own breathing. As Schley moved deeper into the cluttered space, his light fell upon an object hanging from a meat hook, suspended from the rafters. At first, in the dim, flickering light, its identity was unclear. It was large, pale, and vaguely human-shaped. Then, with a sickening lurch of realization, the sheriff recognized what it was. The unimaginable had become real. It was the naked, headless body of a woman, hung upside down by her ankles, disemboweled, and dressed out like a deer. The horror of the sight was instantaneous and overwhelming, a visceral punch that left even the hardened lawman momentarily stunned. This was no ordinary crime scene. This was a butcher's den, a place of unimaginable depravity. The search for Bernice Worden had come to a brutal, horrifying end. The discovery confirmed their worst fears and plunged them headlong into a nightmare far darker than any of them could have possibly conceived. The initial shock was quickly followed by a chilling question: what other horrors lay hidden within this house? The officers, now gripped by a mixture of revulsion and grim duty, knew they had to press on. The main house remained unexplored, a dark, silent entity promising further terrors. The stench from within, a cloying mix of decay, unwashed bodies, and something else, something uniquely foul, grew stronger as they approached the sealed-off sections. Accessing the main living quarters of the farmhouse meant stepping through a threshold not just into another room, but into the very heart of Ed Gein's madness. The squalor was immediate and overwhelming. Every surface was covered in filth, mounds of garbage, old magazines, tin cans, and bizarre, unidentifiable objects. As their eyes adjusted to the dim light, filtered through grime-caked windows and supplemented by their wavering flashlights, the investigators began to discern the true nature of the chaos surrounding them. It wasn't just dirt and refuse. Intermingled with the everyday squalor were items that defied belief, objects crafted from human remains. The full extent of the nightmare was only just beginning to unveil itself. Each step deeper into the farmhouse revealed a new layer of horror, a testament to years of unchecked psychosis and macabre creativity. The quiet, odd handyman from Plainfield had curated a private hell within these decaying walls. Section 4. A Museum of Mutilation, Cataloging the Unspeakable. The scene that confronted the investigators within Ed Gein's farmhouse was beyond any precedent, a tableau of human degradation that defied easy description. It was a museum of mutilation, a charnel house where the lines between human and object, life and death, had been horrifyingly erased. As they moved cautiously from one squalid room to another, their flashlights illuminated a collection of artifacts so grotesque they seemed ripped from the most deranged nightmare. The air itself felt poisoned by the things they saw, the sheer, unadulterated madness made tangible in every corner of the dwelling, a place entirely given over to death. Among the first items to be cataloged were human skulls. Some had been meticulously sawn across the top, their cranial cavities cleaned out to form crude bowls, still bearing remnants of what might have been food. Others were mounted on bedposts, silent, grinning sentinels in the darkness. The sheer number of these macabre relics hinted at a long and prolific period of grave robbing, a systematic plundering of the dead. Each skull represented a violation, a human being reduced to a household implement, a decorative horror in Gein's private world of decay and obsession. The officers worked with grim determination, documenting each find with a forced professionalism that belied their inner turmoil. The horror did not end with bones. Furniture within the farmhouse bore witness to Gein's ghoulish craftsmanship. Chair seats were found to be upholstered, not with conventional fabric, but with tanned human skin stretched taut and stitched into place. A wastebasket was also made of human skin. A lampshade, perhaps one of an investigator's most chilling discoveries, was fashioned from a human face, its features eerily preserved, casting a ghastly pallor when illuminated. These were not random acts of desecration. They were deliberate creations, items carefully constructed for use, integrating the dead into the mundane fabric of Gein's solitary existence. The list of horrors grew with every passing moment. Investigators found leggings made from human leg skin, a corset crafted from a female torso, complete from shoulders to waist. They discovered a belt made from human nipples, a collection of preserved female genitalia in a shoebox, and masks created from the faces of dead women. The sheer volume and variety of these human trophies were staggering. It became chillingly clear that Ed Gein had not just been robbing graves, he had been systematically harvesting human bodies, dismembering them, and using their parts to furnish his home and, as they would later learn, to fuel his ultimate, terrifying fantasy. Section 5. Echoes of the lost Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan found. The most immediate and pressing horror discovered in the summer kitchen was, of course, the butchered remains of Bernice Worden. Her body, decapitated and dressed out like a hunter's kill, was a brutal confirmation of her murder. Her head was later found in a burlap sack elsewhere on the property, her eyes and mouth stitched shut by some accounts, adding another layer of macabre ritual to her demise. The discovery sent a shockwave through Plainfield, transforming their missing neighbor and friend into the victim of an almost unimaginable atrocity. The quiet town's innocence was shattered, replaced by a sickening realization of the evil that had resided so close. As investigators meticulously combed through the charnel house, they uncovered evidence related to another missing woman, Mary Hogan. Hogan, a 54-year-old tavern owner from the nearby town of Pine Grove, had vanished 3 years earlier, in December 1954. Her disappearance had remained a baffling cold case. Now, within Gein's home, a mask made from a woman's face was found, which authorities believed to be Mary Hogan's. Her skull was also identified among the grim collection. The connection was undeniable. Ed Gein was not just a grave robber. He was a killer, responsible for the deaths of at least 2 women, their fates sealed within his house of horrors. When Ed Gein was initially apprehended at his neighbor's house and later brought to the Waushara County Jail, his demeanor was unsettlingly calm, almost detached. He was polite and cooperative with the officers, a stark contrast to the monstrous nature of his crimes. He spoke in a low, soft voice, often rambling. He did not initially confess to murder, but he readily admitted to the grave robbings, explaining his nocturnal visits to cemeteries as if they were mundane errands. This apparent lack of remorse or even comprehension of the gravity of his actions was deeply disturbing to the investigators who were still reeling from the sights within his home. The sheer scale of the atrocities unearthed at the Gein farm overwhelmed the senses and sensibilities of even the most seasoned law enforcement officers. The farmhouse was not merely a crime scene, it was a monument to one man's descent into profound madness. The task of collecting evidence, of cataloging each human fragment, each grotesque creation, was a nightmarish undertaking. The investigators worked through the night and into the following days, each discovery adding to the portrait of a killer whose depravity knew no bounds. Plainfield, Wisconsin, had unwillingly become the epicenter of a horror story that would grip the nation and the world. Section 6. A confession of nightmares, the woman's suit revealed. Under interrogation, the wall of Ed Gein's strange detachment began to crumble, not into remorse, but into a chillingly matter-of-fact recitation of his deeds. He confessed to the murder of Bernice Worden, describing how he had shot her with a .22 caliber rifle at the hardware store before transporting her body back to his farm in her own truck. He also admitted to killing Mary Hogan years earlier, similarly shooting her at her tavern. His accounts were delivered in a flat, unemotional tone, devoid of any apparent understanding of the horror he was describing. For Gein, these acts seemed almost like necessities, steps in a larger, deeply personal project. Beyond the 2 murders, Gein openly discussed his extensive grave-robbing activities. He claimed to have made as many as 40 nocturnal visits to local cemeteries over a period of several years. He would check the obituaries for recent burials of middle-aged women, those he felt might resemble his deceased mother, Augusta. He described how he would dig up the graves, often with the help of a local acquaintance who was apparently unaware of Gein's true intentions, believing they were on simple if morbid excursions. Gein insisted he never had sexual relations with the corpses, stating he exhumed them because he was in a daze-like state. The most disturbing revelation, however, concerned his ultimate motive. When questioned about the purpose behind his gruesome collection of human skin and body parts, Gein unveiled his darkest secret. He confessed that he had been attempting to create a woman's suit. He explained that he wanted to make a suit of female skin so that he could literally embody a woman to become his mother. He spoke of wearing the skin, of feeling what it was like to be female. This grotesque ambition to crawl into the skin of another, to resurrect Augusta by becoming her, was the horrifying centerpiece of his psychosis, the driving force behind his years of desecration and murder. The authorities were stunned by the confession. The sheer bizarreness of his motive, coupled with the tangible evidence from his farmhouse, painted a portrait of a man utterly consumed by a terrifying delusion. The woman's suit, the skin vests, the masks, the leggings, all were components of this monstrous project. His crimes were not driven by lust in the conventional sense, nor by greed or simple sadism. They were the product of a profoundly fractured mind, a desperate, pathological attempt to deal with overwhelming grief, loneliness, and an obsessive, unresolved fixation on his domineering mother. The discovery of Gein's horrors and his subsequent confession dragged the darkest of human nightmares into the cold light of reality. Section 1. The Threshold of Justice, Initial Proceedings and Questions of Sanity. The grisly revelations from Ed Gein's farmhouse sent shockwaves far beyond Plainfield. News of the horrors electrified the nation, painting a chilling portrait of the quiet, unassuming man. Gein was formally arrested, and the initial charge was for the murder of Bernice Worden. His confession, horrifyingly detailed, left little doubt about his actions. Yet, as the legal process began, a profound question loomed large. Was Ed Gein sane enough to understand his crimes, or to stand trial for them? The nature of his atrocities, the sheer unimaginable bizarreness of his woman suit and ghastly trophies, screamed of a mind utterly detached from reality. The legal system found itself grappling with an unprecedented case. The crimes were so grotesque, so far outside the realm of common understanding, that the usual parameters of justice seemed insufficient. The initial arraignment was a somber affair, with Gein appearing bewildered, almost childlike amidst the storm of public revulsion and media attention. It became immediately clear that his mental state would be the central issue. The court quickly ordered comprehensive psychiatric evaluations. The focus began to shift from the stark question of guilt, which his confession seemed to establish, to the more complex, nebulous territory of his mental competency and criminal responsibility. Psychiatrists were tasked with peering into the abyss of Ed Gein's mind. Their examinations sought to unravel the tangled threads of his psychosis. Doctors who interviewed him described a man who was polite, cooperative, and strangely passive. He spoke of his grave robbings and even the murders with a disturbing lack of emotion, a flat affect that chilled seasoned professionals. He seemed unable to grasp the enormity of his actions or the profound horror they induced in others. His world was one of an alternate reality, populated by his mother's enduring presence and his own twisted interpretations of life and death. Ultimately, the findings of these initial evaluations were stark and unambiguous. Ed Gein was diagnosed with schizophrenia and profound psychosis. On November 21, 1957, just days after the discovery, he was found legally insane and therefore unfit to stand trial. He did not understand the charges against him and could not assist in his own defense. This ruling meant he would not immediately face a jury for his crimes. Instead, he was to be committed to a secure psychiatric facility. For some, this felt like justice denied, while for others, it was a grim acknowledgement of a mind so broken it was beyond conventional punishment. Section 2. Commitment to darkness life at Central State Hospital. Following the court's decision, Ed Gein was committed to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Waupun, Wisconsin, later renamed the Mendota Mental Health Institute. This institution was designed to house individuals whose mental illnesses made them a danger to themselves or others, and who were entangled with the criminal justice system. For Gein, it marked the beginning of a life confined not by prison bars in the traditional sense, but by the walls of a high-security psychiatric facility. His arrival was met with a mixture of trepidation and intense curiosity by the staff, who were now responsible for the man behind America's most ghastly headlines. Within the structured environment of Central State, Gein's demeanor remained largely unchanged from his initial arrest. He was, by most accounts, a model patient. He was quiet, docile, and followed institutional rules without complaint. He engaged in simple tasks, participated in occupational therapy, and generally avoided any conflict with staff or other inmates. This placid behavior stood in shocking contrast to the monstrous acts he had committed. It was as if the ferocious, obsessive drive that led to grave robbing and murder had been extinguished, or at least submerged, once he was removed from his isolated farmhouse and the triggers it contained. The psychiatric staff continued to observe and assess Gein. His diagnosis of schizophrenia, characterized by severe thought disorder, delusions, and hallucinations, was consistently upheld. Doctors noted his deep, unresolved fixation on his mother, Augusta, which remained a central theme in his fragmented thoughts. He often spoke of her with a strange reverence, seemingly oblivious to the destructive impact her oppressive upbringing had on his psyche. His understanding of his crimes remained shallow, almost childlike. He displayed little in the way of true remorse, often expressing confusion about why his actions had caused such widespread horror and condemnation. This paradox of the model patient who had perpetrated such heinous acts was a constant source of bafflement. Gein was polite, cooperative, and even described by some staff as likable in his own odd way. Yet, this was the same man who had exhumed corpses, fashioned household items from human remains, and brutally murdered at least 2 women. His apparent inability to connect his actions with their horrific consequences underscored the profound depth of his mental illness. He lived within his own internal world, a world largely inaccessible to others, where the boundaries of right and wrong were grotesquely distorted beyond recognition. Section 3. Delayed Judgment, the 1968 Trial. More than a decade passed. Ed Gein remained confined at Central State Hospital, his case a chilling footnote in criminal history. However, in 1968, a significant development occurred. After years of treatment and observation, medical authorities determined that Ed Gein was now competent to stand trial. His mental condition had apparently stabilized to a point where he could understand the legal proceedings and, theoretically, assist in his defense. This decision reopened a chapter that many thought permanently closed, promising a delayed, formal reckoning for the crimes that had horrified the nation 11 years prior. The stage was set for a trial. The trial of Ed Gein finally commenced on November 7, 1968. For pragmatic reasons, the prosecution chose to focus on a single count, the first-degree murder of Bernice Worden. The evidence against him was substantial, much of it stemming from his own detailed confessions and the gruesome discoveries made at his farm. The courtroom was filled with an air of grim fascination. Witnesses recounted the horrors found in the Gein farmhouse, and Gein himself, now 62 years old, sat quietly, his demeanor much the same as it had always been, detached, seemingly unemotional, an enigma to all who observed him. Gein's defense attorney William Belter did not contest the facts of the killing. Instead, the defense strategy centered on Gein's mental state at the time of the crime, arguing that he was not guilty by reason of insanity. This was a crucial distinction. The trial effectively became a battle of psychiatric testimonies, with experts for both the prosecution and defense offering their assessments of Gein's sanity in 1957. The gruesome details of his life, his obsessions, and his macabre creations were once again brought into the public eye, forcing a re-examination of the nature of madness and culpability. On November 14, 1968, after a week-long trial, Judge Robert H. Gallmar delivered the verdict. Ed Gein was found guilty of the murder of Bernice Worden. However, in a second phase of the trial focusing on his sanity, he was also found to have been legally insane at the time the crime was committed. This dual verdict meant that while he was criminally responsible for his actions, his profound mental illness negated full culpability in the traditional sense. Consequently, he was not sentenced to prison. Instead, Ed Gein was ordered to be returned to Central State Hospital, where he would spend the remainder of his life under psychiatric care. Section 4. The Final Lock, Institutionalization, and the End of a Haunting Life. Following the 1968 trial, Ed Gein was recommitted to the Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. Later the Mendota Mental Health Institute, the place that had been his home for over a decade. The verdict confirmed his status as both murderer and madman, ensuring he would never again be a free man. His life settled into the monotonous routine of institutional care. He continued to be a quiet and generally cooperative patient, engaging in simple work assignments and rarely causing any trouble for the staff. The grotesque energy that had fueled his earlier horrors seemed to have dissipated entirely within the confines of the hospital walls. During these later years, there was little indication that Gein ever achieved significant insight into the true nature or impact of his crimes. His delusions, particularly concerning his mother, likely persisted, though perhaps in a less acute form due to medication and the structured environment. He reportedly enjoyed reading, especially adventure stories and National Geographic magazines, offering a glimpse into a mind that sought escape, however mundane. He never expressed profound remorse in a way that satisfied public or psychiatric expectations. His understanding of his past remained filtered through the lens of his severe, lifelong mental illness. He was a relic of his own horrific story, As the years turned into decades, Ed Gein aged within the institution. His physical health began to decline. In the early 1980s, he was diagnosed with cancer. His body, which he had once sought to transform through the skin of others, began to fail him. He faced his final illness with the same passivity that had characterized much of his institutionalized life. The man whose crimes had inspired nightmares and cinematic monsters was slowly fading, his real-life horror story drawing towards its inevitable, quiet conclusion, far from the isolated farmhouse that bore witness to his darkest acts. Edward Theodore Gein died on July 26, 1984, at the age of 77, from respiratory failure due to complications from cancer. He passed away at the Mendota Mental Health Institute, the secure facility that had been his world for nearly 27 years. His body was later buried in an unmarked grave in the Plainfield Cemetery, the very same cemetery he had once violated under the cover of darkness. He was laid to rest beside his family, including his mother Augusta. The quiet end to his life stood in stark contrast to the terror and sensationalism his name had once invoked, closing a profoundly disturbing chapter in American crime history. Section 1. The unsettling muse Gein's crimes as dark inspiration. The grotesque revelations from Ed Gein's Plainfield farm did more than just horrify the American public. They seeped into the nation's subconscious. His story, a real-life tale of isolation, maternal obsession, and macabre craftsmanship, became a dark wellspring for creative minds. The raw materials were too potent to ignore. An isolated farmhouse, a domineering deceased mother, human skin masks, and furniture made from bones. These were not the products of a fiction writer's overactive imagination. They were documented facts, chilling realities unearthed in rural Wisconsin. This truth, far stranger and more disturbing than fiction, offered a new blueprint for horror. The case of Ed Gein resonated deeply because it shattered comforting illusions. It revealed that monsters were not confined to Gothic castles or distant lands. They could be the quiet neighbor, the unassuming recluse. This proximity of evil, its potential to lurk behind a mundane facade, was a terrifying concept. Writers and filmmakers, always searching for new ways to explore fear, found Gein's story irresistible. It provided a uniquely American brand of horror, rooted in the quiet desperation of the heartland, the psychological decay bred by isolation, and the terrifying potential hidden within the seemingly ordinary average man. Gein's specific pathologies offered a rich tapestry for character development. His unhealthy consuming fixation on his mother Augusta provided a chilling template for dysfunctional family dynamics taken to their most extreme conclusions. The desire to preserve or even become a deceased matriarch was a novel and deeply unsettling psychological hook. Furthermore, his gruesome hobbies, the creation of objects from human remains, introduced a tangible, visceral element of horror. It wasn't just about murder, it was about the horrifying aftermath, the transformation of human bodies into trophies and tools, a profound desecration that struck a primal nerve. The impact was not immediate in all its forms, but the seeds were sown in the late 1950s. As news of Gein's atrocities spread, the details became part of a grim American folklore. This folklore, in turn, began to influence popular culture, particularly the burgeoning genres of psychological thrillers and exploitation horror. Gein's legacy would not be one of infamy alone. It would be one of dark inspiration, providing the grotesque framework for some of cinema's most enduring and terrifying villains. His shadow would stretch long over Hollywood, leaving an indelible mark on the landscape of cinematic fear for decades to come. Perhaps the earliest and most direct cinematic descendant of Ed Gein's twisted legacy is Norman Bates, the seemingly shy and boyish proprietor of the Bates Motel in Alfred Hitchcock's 1960 masterpiece. The novel, penned by author Robert Bloch, was published in 1959, just 2 years after Gein's arrest. Bloch lived in Wisconsin at the time, a mere 35 miles from Plainfield. He was acutely aware of the Gein case, and while he later stated that the direct inspiration was more general knowledge of rural isolation and pathology, the parallels between Gein and Norman are too striking to be coincidental, deeply embedded in the character's core. The most significant parallel lies in the suffocating pathological relationship between Norman and his mother, Norma Bates. Like Ed Gein with Augusta, Norman is utterly dominated by his mother even after her death. Gein preserved Augusta's room as a shrine and attempted to become her. Norman, in a similar vein, preserves his mother's corpse, engages in conversations with her skeletal remains, and ultimately adopts her persona. This chilling psychological fusion, where the son assumes the identity of the deceased, controlling mother, is a direct echo of Gein's own deeply disturbed maternal fixation, and his desire to resurrect or embody Augusta. Hitchcock's film brought this terrifying dynamic to a vast audience, forever etching the image of the Bates Motel and its disturbed keeper into popular culture. The film's genius lies in its slow reveal of Norman's madness, his outward awkwardness masking a murderous alter ego shaped by mother. The iconic shower scene, while not directly mirroring Gein's crimes, captures the shocking brutality that can erupt from such a fractured psyche. The Bates house, looming ominously behind the motel, much like Gein's isolated farmhouse, becomes a symbol of hidden horrors and the inescapable influence of a dead, yet all-powerful maternal figure. Robert Bloch himself acknowledged that he was struck by the idea of a man like Gein, living in such profound isolation, and how such loneliness could curdle into madness. While Norman Bates is not a direct biographical sketch of Ed Gein was a grave robber and murderer, but not necessarily a serial killer in the same vein as Norman's mother persona, the psychological underpinnings are undeniably shared. The themes of repressed sexuality, identity dissolution, and the monstrous manifestation of grief and obsession, all present in Gein's story, are central to the chilling power of Norman Bates, making him Gein's first truly iconic cinematic offspring. If explored the psychological horrors inspired by Ed Gein, then Tobe Hooper's 1974 relentless shocker plunged audiences directly into a visceral recreation of his gruesome handiwork. Hooper has openly cited Ed Gein as a primary influence on the film, particularly on the character of Leatherface and the nightmarish environment of the Sawyer family's home. While the film presents a family of cannibals, a deviation from Gein's specific crimes, the aesthetic of their lair and Leatherface's terrifying appearance owe a significant debt to the discoveries made in Plainfield, Wisconsin, nearly 2 decades earlier. The most striking visual parallel is Leatherface's infamous mask. Gein was found to have created masks from human female faces, a chilling attempt to transform his identity. Leatherface, the hulking mute killer of the Sawyer clan, similarly wears masks stitched together from the skin of his victims. These masks are not just disguises, they appear to reflect different aspects of his fragmented personality, a grotesque echo of Gein's own identity confusion. The raw, stitched-together nature of these skin masks in the film evokes the same horrifying, primitive craftsmanship found in Gein's farmhouse, a chilling testament to a mind that views human bodies as mere material. Beyond the masks, the Sawyer family home is a direct cinematic reflection of the Gein farmhouse's interior horrors. The film's production design features furniture and decorations made from human bones and skin. Viewers are confronted with armchairs adorned with skeletal arms, lamps incorporating human bones, and a general atmosphere of charnel house artistry. This grotesque decor directly mirrors the chairs upholstered in human skin, the skull bowls, and other human-derived artifacts found by investigators at Gein's property. Hooper amplified these elements, creating a relentless visual assault that immersed the audience in a world where human bodies were harvested and repurposed with chilling creativity. While is often remembered for its shocking violence and relentless terror, its true horror lies in this appropriation of Gein's specific brand of domestic ghastliness. Leatherface, with his skin masks and chainsaw, became an instant horror icon, but the truly unsettling power of the film stems from the realization that his horrifying home, filled with the remains of the dead, was inspired by a real place. Tobe Hooper took the isolated rural madness of Ed Gein and transplanted it to the sun-scorched landscape of Texas, unleashing a nightmare that felt terrifyingly plausible precisely because its roots lay in documented human depravity. Nearly 2 decades after Leatherface first revved his chainsaw, another iconic cinematic villain emerged, drawing directly from the most disturbing aspect of Ed Gein's psyche, James Gumb, better known as Buffalo Bill, in Jonathan Demme's 1991 Academy Award-winning thriller. While Buffalo Bill is a composite character, influenced by several real-life serial killers, his defining characteristic, the abduction and murder of women to create a woman's suit from their skin, is a chillingly direct echo of Ed Gein's ultimate confessed obsession. Gein's nightmarish project found its most sophisticated and psychologically terrifying cinematic expression in this character. Thomas Harris, in his novel upon which the film is based, explicitly wove Gein's macabre ambition into Buffalo Bill's modus operandi. Bill's desperate pathological desire to transform his identity, to shed his male skin and become female by literally wearing the skin of women, mirrors Gein's own statements about wanting to become his mother. The film graphically depicts Bill's process, the selection of victims, the grim tailoring of their skin, and the chilling moment he dances before a mirror, draped in his grotesque creation. This horrifying ritual of transformation is Gein's madness reimagined with a chilling, calculating precision. Unlike the more primitive creations of Gein or the crude masks of Leatherface, Buffalo Bill's woman suit is presented as part of a more complex, albeit deeply disturbed, psychological narrative about identity and gender dysphoria, though the film's portrayal has been criticized for its depiction of transgender issues. However, the core concept of using human skin for metamorphosis is pure Gein. The film taps into a profound unease about the violation of the body and the terrifying lengths to which a fractured mind will go to achieve an impossible transformation, making the woman's suit a potent symbol of ultimate self-loathing and desperate delusion. Through Norman Bates's maternal fixation, Leatherface's house of horrors and skin masks, and Buffalo Bill's obsessive creation of a woman's suit, Ed Gein's dark legacy has been permanently etched into the annals of cinema. These characters, each iconic in their own right, carry fragments of Gein's disturbed mind and gruesome deeds. They serve as enduring reminders that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not born of pure fantasy, but are chilling reflections of real-life horrors, their darkness amplified on screen, ensuring that Ed Gein, the quiet farmer from Plainfield, continues to haunt Hollywood's nightmares and by extension our own. To comprehend the actions of Ed Gein is to embark on a disturbing journey into a labyrinth of profound psychological torment. He was not a monster in the mythical sense, nor was he a calculating criminal driven by conventional motives of greed or revenge. Instead, his horrific deeds were the desperate, grotesque manifestations of a psyche shattered by a unique and deeply damaging upbringing. Psychologists and criminologists have long grappled with his case, attempting to piece together the fractured elements of his mind. His story stands as a chilling testament to the devastating impact of extreme maternal dominance, suffocating isolation, and the insidious progression of severe mental illness, forcing us to confront the darkest capabilities hidden within human nature. The shadow of Augusta Gein looms inescapably large over any analysis of her son's psyche, acting as the primary architect of his warped internal world. Her brand of religious fanaticism was not one of comfort or love but of hellfire, damnation, and unrelenting judgment. She instilled in Ed a deep-seated fear and revulsion for the outside world, particularly for women, whom she painted as inherently sinful vessels of temptation, with herself as the sole exception. This constant barrage of negativity, combined with her absolute control over his thoughts and actions, created a deeply distorted reality for young Ed. He was taught to equate sexuality with sin and human connection with corruption, leaving him profoundly ill-equipped for any form of healthy adult life. This toxic maternal influence was catastrophically amplified by the extreme isolation Augusta deliberately imposed upon her family. By moving them to the remote farmstead in Plainfield, she effectively severed Ed and his brother Henry from normal social interactions and developmental experiences. Ed had no friends, no alternative role models, no external benchmarks against which to measure his mother's increasingly bizarre pronouncements. His universe was confined to the farm and Augusta's doctrines. Consequently, when she died, he was left psychologically adrift, completely alone in a world he had been taught to fear, his mind an echo chamber for her terrifying beliefs and his own burgeoning, unaddressed pathologies, with no anchor to objective reality. Clinically, Ed Gein was diagnosed with schizophrenia and severe psychosis, conditions that profoundly impacted his perception of reality and his ability to function. Schizophrenia often involves a breakdown in the relation between thought, emotion, and behavior, leading to faulty perception, inappropriate actions and feelings, and withdrawal from reality into fantasy and delusion. For Gein, this meant his fantasies, particularly those surrounding his mother in the female form, became more compelling and real than the objective world. His polite, almost childlike demeanor observed after his arrest was not a cunning act of deception but a genuine reflection of his detachment and his inability to fully grasp the terrifying nature of his crimes. Understanding Ed Gein's motivations requires moving beyond simplistic labels of evil, for his crimes were not born from typical criminal impulses such as calculated malice, unrestrained lust, or a quest for material gain. Instead, his actions were the horrifying symphony of a mind consumed by overwhelming grief, an all-encompassing obsession with his deceased mother, and profound, untreated delusions. He did not seek to inflict pain for its own sake in a sadistic manner. Rather, his gruesome activities were part of a deeply personal, albeit pathologically twisted, quest. He aimed to preserve, to recreate, and ultimately to transform, using human remains as the medium for his nightmarish internal dramas, driven by psychological forces he could neither control nor fully comprehend. The death of Augusta Gein in 1945 was the cataclysmic event that fully unleashed the horrors within Ed. She had been the absolute center of his universe, the sole object of his devotion and the enforcer of his reality. Her absence created a psychological vacuum so immense it threatened to annihilate his already fragile sense of self. The intense loneliness and unresolved grief festered, mutating into a desperate need to reclaim her presence. His initial grave-robbing excursions can be seen as a macabre attempt to combat this unbearable solitude, to surround himself with female forms that, in his distorted perception, represented his mother, thereby attempting to physically deny the finality of her loss. This obsessive grief spiraled into the horrifying ambition that has come to define his case, the creation of a woman's suit. This was not merely about collecting trophies or creating grotesque art, it was the ultimate chilling manifestation of his desire to merge with, or entirely become, Augusta. The meticulous crafting of garments from human skin represented a pathological attempt at transubstantiation, a way to literally inhabit the female form he both feared and idolized. By wearing the skin of women, he perhaps sought to resurrect his mother within himself, to reclaim her power, or to resolve his profound confusion about his own identity in the most extreme and terrifying manner imaginable. His apparent lack of remorse or true understanding of the societal horror his actions induced was a direct consequence of his psychotic state. He was not a sociopath feigning innocence. He genuinely inhabited a different reality, one where his ghoulish creations and acts of desecration held a perverse logic. When confronted by authorities, his confusion and childlike responses were not manipulative, but indicative of a mind unable to bridge the chasm between his internal fantasy world and the objective reality of his crimes. For Ed Gein, the horrors he committed were, in some deeply disturbed way, necessary steps in his desperate, delusional quest for connection and identity. Beyond the gruesome details of his crimes, Ed Gein's most enduring and unsettling legacy is the personification of the monster next door. He shattered the comforting illusion that evil always wears an obvious, menacing face. Gein was the quiet handyman, the peculiar but seemingly harmless recluse whom neighbors might have dismissed as merely odd. This terrifying dissonance between his mundane exterior and the unimaginable horrors he concealed within his farmhouse forced a chilling re-evaluation of the nature of evil. It demonstrated that the most profound darkness could fester behind a facade of utter normalcy, walking unnoticed among us, a truth far more disturbing than any fictional bogeyman. The case of Ed Gein serves as a stark and horrifying mirror, reflecting the profound fragility of the human psyche and the devastating consequences of unchecked trauma and isolation. His life story is a grim chronicle of how a mind subjected to relentless psychological abuse, extreme social deprivation, and severe mental illness can fracture and descend into unimaginable depths. It highlights how an individual, starved of healthy human connection and warped by a toxic upbringing, can construct an alternate reality governed by a terrifying internal logic. His existence forces us to acknowledge the potential for such profound aberration, however rare, within the spectrum of human experience, a chilling testament to brokenness. The profound impact of Gein's real-life horrors on popular culture is undeniable. His story provided the dark, fertile soil from which some of cinema's most iconic villains, Norman Bates, Leatherface, and Buffalo Bill, sprang. These characters, each echoing different facets of Gein's psychology and crimes, have haunted the collective imagination for decades. This enduring fascination is not merely morbid curiosity, it reflects a deeper societal need to explore, understand and perhaps contain the darkest extremes of human behavior through narrative. The cinematic monsters he inspired serve as a constant reminder of the real-world horrors that spawned them, keeping his chilling legacy alive in our cultural consciousness. Ultimately, the true horror of Ed Gein lies not in his monstrosity, but in his undeniable, twisted humanity. He was not an alien entity, but a man whose life took a uniquely horrifying path due to a confluence of devastating factors. His story compels us to look beyond simplistic notions of good and evil, to consider the complex interplay of environment, upbringing and mental health in shaping human behavior. The abyss that was Ed Gein's life serves as a permanent, chilling reminder that the veneer of civilization can be terrifyingly thin, and that the capacity for unimaginable darkness might lurk closer than we dare to believe, hidden behind the most ordinary of faces.